Hello, my name is Rebecca Garcia, and my Keystone project is called Music at the Museum of Fine Arts, and it is an audio tour of Western music history. So to begin, sound is not permanent, and that means that after your alarm clock goes off or a singer closes their mouth, that noise is gone forever. And that's part of what makes a live performance so special, but it's also what makes it so difficult for music historians to study music from the past. Because if you think about it, an archaeologist can uncover an Egyptian tomb, and scholars can read Shakespeare's exact words, but music historians can't just stand here and listen to exactly what a violinist sounded like in the Renaissance. So to make things a little more complicated, the word music is such a general term. If we even are just applying it to today and what people consider to be music today, some people might think of classical music or rap or dubstep or classical or country or the piano and the GSU. And so because of that, it's just like the noises that are arranged into things that we would consider to be music today might not necessarily be noises that people would consider to be music 100 or 200 or even 1,000 years ago. And so it's just, because of that, it's so difficult for us to formulate what it might have been like in the past. But luckily, music historians have four main ways of piecing together exactly what music sounded like. First, we have music. After the 1870s, After the 1870s, we have recorded music, but also there's notated music, sheet music, and music passed down through oral tradition. There's also physical remains that refers to instruments or performance spaces or concert halls, writing from ancient Greek times through biblical references, through modern texts today. There are references to writing, and finally, visual images. And that's what I chose to focus on in my tour, because visual images can really enhance our understanding of music history. Not only do they, so basically visual images are any depiction of an instrument or a musician in art or sculpture or painting, and they enhance our understanding because not only do you see exactly what an instrument looked like and what someone looked like while they were playing it, but also based on the context that that musician is placed in the painting, we get a better idea of the role of music in society at that time. For instance, and this is an excerpt from my first stop on my tour, this is from a piece of pottery from ancient Greece. It is a drinking cup. And you'll notice on the decorations, there is a man here playing a double piped instrument, and that's called the aulos. And the aulos sounded, we imagine, a little bit like the bagpipes, and it was very popular in ancient Greece. And it was associated with the Greek god Dionysus, who was the god of pleasure, of excess, of wine, of drinking. And so you'll notice that the figures that are on this piece of pottery do look like they're having a pretty good time. And so the aulos is very prominent in Greek art, and it's usually pops up in scenarios such as this, where all kind of bacchanalia situations. And there were lots of festivals to Dionysus in ancient Greece, and the aulos was prominently used there, and people would dance to this. And this is in stark contrast with the depictions of the lyre, which it was another instrument popular in ancient Greece. And it's a string instrument. It was a handheld harp, but it's featured in far more intellectual contexts. Here, it's being used to accompany a man singing poetry. And rather than on a drinking cup, it's depicted on a ceremonial oil flask. So these are two just very different instruments used for two very different activities. And this is interesting for us, not just because it's interesting to know what kind of music the Greeks were partying to, but also because it actually ended up affecting music history for the next couple of centuries. Because in the Middle Ages and the medieval times, the church was largely in charge of what kind of music was being composed. And they definitely did not want these instruments that were associated with such naughty activities near their sacred music and in their churches. So with the church in charge of what kind of music was being composed, for a really long time, it was only vocal music and once in a while strings. You think of Gregorian chants, of masses, etc. And it was actually centuries before composers started incorporating winds and brass into their pieces. But that was long after many musical developments had occurred for vocal music. So just to reiterate, my tour is an audio tour of the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. And it goes from ancient times to the 20th century, leading you through predetermined galleries where you learn about art, or you learn about music from the art that correlates with the time period. So for instance, here is a Botticelli painting that you will see while learning about the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was a time of rebirth and a rebirth of interest in classical antiquity. And so artists were able to express this interest by looking at models of architecture and art from antiquity and incorporating it into their paintings. For instance, you see here Botticelli has used some architecture in the back that you can see recognized as classical architecture, and even the garments that the figures are wearing are associated with classical times. But as we've gone over, musicians can't just listen back and hear what music sounded like in ancient Greece. So music history took a little different turn here because they didn't have those models, the Parthenon, to build on. And so what ended up happening is they kind of improvised and created these Greek drama theater spectacles based on what they imagined Greek dramas to be, incorporating mythology and alternating with instruments and solos and theatrical productions and these huge costumes, and it actually ended up leading into the birth of opera. So as well as you go on into the tour, you'll notice that there are a lot of similar and parallel developments in the development of music and the development of art. Look at these two paintings, and you'll notice that they're both landscape paintings of the seaside, but they're painted in very different styles. So the first painting that we're looking at was painted near the end of the 18th century, and this was in the time of the Enlightenment. So everything was there was a huge movement of order and reason and light and knowledge, and you'll notice that the lines are very clear, the brushstrokes are very small. It's attempting to be as realistic as possible. The lines are very clearly defined. We have a little story going on with some bandits. It's trying to, there's a triangular form. You'll notice form was very important, and in particular the triangle in art history. And likewise, in music, there were also forms that were being developed, and these rules that were being set that music was supposed to be adhering to. And so we're going to listen to a piano piece written by Mozart, where you'll hear a very clear melody line and accompanying line, and you'll hear that it sounds very balanced and ordered, sort of like similar to this painting. And so even though we can't play the entire piece, this piece also has very specific repeating sections and very specific endings. And this is a transition. So it has very clear places where it's supposed to repeat, where it's supposed to go into certain parts. And so by contrast, this is the other painting that I showed you. And it was painted towards the end of the 19th century by a French painter named Claude Monet. And you'll notice that even though it's at the seaside, the brushstrokes are not as small, and it's not trying to portray this as realistically as possible, but is instead using the colors, the looser brushstrokes, and just kind of fuzzy edges and the timbre and the color there, and the play with light to create an impression. And so this was called Impressionism. And so the direction that art has gone in, the most important thing, according to artists, was not anymore being as realistic and balanced as possible, but instead what kind of impression and what kind of effect was the painting evoking in the viewer? What kind of emotions was it evoking? And just kind of capturing either nature or landscapes in a way that evoked this sort of response. And so likewise, as you can see, like order was not as important. And likewise in music, Impressionism also became a thing because while you heard a very clear melody before, and that was the most important part of the music, now people were writing in a way that maybe wasn't necessarily as ordered or as didn't have the right and left hand going according to what people, in a harmony according to what people would have expected, but instead it was more supposed to create, did it reflect the image that it was supposed to be depicting as well. So right now we're going to listen to a piece by Debussy, who is also a French composer, and it's a piano piece just like the piece you just listened to. But you'll notice it's a little bit different. And Debussy has a famous quote that goes along the lines of music. He wasn't concerned with music theory or with rules. He said pleasure is the law. So this is a piece about reflections on the water. So you can hear how it's a little bit more ambiguous than the other piece, and it might not have a melody. You can't really sing this like you could the other line, but it's trying to depict exactly what reflections on the water might have looked like, the audio version of that. And you can hear that it sometimes sounds a little atonal. So just to kind of go back to that, you can imagine how people who are used to hearing this and thought of this as music might be a little bit upset that this is the direction that music had gone in. And likewise, people who might view those ordered paintings and that as the ideal might be a little upset, or people who were excited about this intellectual development in music and in art, and how people were subverting rules in favor of other ideals there. So I wish I could give you the entire tour right now, but unfortunately that would take too long. But I promise if you come to the Museum of Fine Arts, you can learn about ornamentation in violin Baroque music by looking at ornamentation on Dutch furniture, and learn about why the string quartet became so popular during the French Revolution, and so much more by going to, by going to musicmfa.com, where the tour will be fully uploaded in May. Yes.
So with the high masterpiece, the comparable selection was Mozart,
Yes.
who seems to have this sort of historical fury and anti-establishmentarian tendency. Why not somebody like Haydn?
So Haydn does come up in my tour as well. He was actually the one who I referred to as with the father of the string quartet. Mozart was anti-establishment, but he also was one of the people who he was one of the composers whose works really solidified form in music. He composed according to very strict rules. He was an extremely prolific composer, wrote over 500 pieces in his lifetime, well over 500. And he did this not only, he was a genius in his own right, but he also had kind of a cheat sheet as far as it goes, where every piece would start out in one key and end up in the dominant of that key and then have a development. And there were several, rules that he was going by according to that. And so he, in addition to Haydn, in addition to a couple other classical composers, helped to really solidify that. So despite his personal politics and what he was accomplishing then, what his music did was really set these musical forms in stone that people would adhere to through the Romantic, even today, and even with Debussy, they were still fighting against these very established musical rules. Yes?
Do you think that listening to music during your walk through a museum would improve visitors' experience overall? Would you encourage other museums to do something similar to this tour?
Yeah, I have to say that the average person, can't remember the exact second count, but the average person spends between 17 and 30 seconds looking at a painting in a museum at any given point. And so this tour would bring a little more meaning to that, so that people aren't just looking at they pass by, but instead listening to the music as you look at the art might in fact deepen your appreciation for both of them. Yeah.